All right, let's talk some Sixers. We've been following him since he was Sixers Adam on Twitter at Temple News. Now he covers the Sixers for Philly Voice. Adam Aronson, thanks for giving us a couple minutes, man.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So the Sixers decided to make the offseason rather interesting for you and everybody else. Before we get into the individual players, let's just start. How dramatically has Mike Gansy and Bob Myers changed the direction and outlook of this franchise in the first offseason?
As dramatically as I've ever seen, at least for a rookie executive like Mike Gansy to step into a lead executive role for the first time and take a team that had really driven a fan base towards apathy over the last couple of years and turn this into, I would argue, the league's most significant national attraction. I can't think of any precedent for something like this in at least the recent history of the NBA. It's just remarkable that after how the 24-25 season went, when the Sixers thought they were championship contenders and ended up tanking for the last 2 months of the season. And even last season, they do win a playoff series, but that was a crazy roller coaster ride of a last month or so, resulting in Daryl Morey getting let go. For just the craziness of the last 2 years to coalesce into a team with Tyrese, Maxey, VJ Edgecombe, Jalen Brown, LeBron James, and Joel Embiid. It's just hard to believe that all of this has happened.
Hey, by the way, count me among the apathetic. I was one who gave up my season tickets a few years ago, got tired of the way the administration was handling things, and quite frankly, the lack of transparency. Are you getting a sense early on that with Morey leaving and Gansy coming and Bob Meyer being here, that there's a new sheriff in town, not just from the names, but also from the way that they're going to conduct business and they're going to treat the fans?
Yeah, it's a good question. Ultimately, I think time will tell. I think it's really easy for the Sixers to be winning the PR battles right now when they've just traded for Jalen Brown and signed LeBron James. To me, the tests always come when things are not going well. And I think even the people that are incredibly optimistic about where this team could go would tell you that there will probably be bumps along the way as they try to figure out the fit with five, very high usage, high volume offensive players. So, and clearly, a lot of injuries and absences to come. Joel Embiid, we all know the history there. LeBron James is going to turn 42 years old at the end of December. This is not going to be a team that we see in full form for 82 games or even close to it. So I certainly hope that Sixers fans find that the organization is more transparent with them moving forward. I think that is always the expectation that fans should have of their organization. It's the standard that they should hold them to. And ultimately, time will tell. And I would just say, again, I think it'll be easier for us to actually sense whether or not the Sixers are turning a corner in that respect when they actually experience some adversity and we see how they handle that.
We'll ask you about the big names in a few minutes, but it has driven me nuts for the past couple of years that basically we got starters and then very little on the bench for a long time. You recently wrote the Sixers finally appear to value every roster spot. Beyond the stars, how much better is the team's depth at this moment than what Nick Nurse had last season?
It is enormously better. I really can't say enough. And that is even with, I believe the Sixers are going to leave a roster spot open heading into the season after signing LeBron and signing Kentavious Caldwell-Pope as well. Just if you ranked, and this is sort of what I did in that story you alluded to, if you just sort of ranked the 14 guys on the Sixers based on their level of importance to the team, I don't think there's necessarily a single player on the roster who is underqualified for their ranking within an NBA roster. Now, you could argue that, Dembona might be the ninth best player on the team, but he's really more important than that because of when Joel doesn't play. And that is all fair. And I think backup center is the one spot depth-wise where you look and you can have real questions. But from, the guys like KCP, who is not in his prime anymore, but is a two-time NBA champion with tons of experience playing alongside a bunch of high-usage stars at the same time, whether it's the Dominic Barlows and Jabari Walkers of the world who, are those guys going to be full-blown rotation pieces? I think Barlow has a good chance of being. I don't think Walker will be. At the very least, those are both guys that Nick Nurse would be comfortable throwing into a game. And I just look at, the opening night roster last year. They had a roster spot open. They had Jared McCain injured. They had Janai Broom, who they never gave a real chance to. They had Kyle Lowry, who was a glorified assistant coach, and they had Eric Gordon, who was a glorified assistant coach. So that's a third of a standard roster with no utility for the first several weeks of the season. And in some of those cases, much longer than the first several weeks of the season. So to me, the importance of that cannot be understated. That's why I wrote about that a few weeks back. I just think it gives this team so much more optionality, and it gives them so much more margin for error where, for example, Dean Wade, who I think is this team's most important reserve, he has never logged a huge workload without getting injured before. He's a pretty injury prone player too. The Sixers have the ability to withstand Dean Wade getting hurt in a way that if Quentin Grimes got hurt on last year's team, who might not even be as good of a player, they wouldn't have had anything they could do about it. They wouldn't have had, any capable reinforcements behind him in their backcourt. So I think that could not possibly be more important. And I think the Sixers are markedly better in terms of their back end roster spots now than they have been over the last, not just year, maybe even 2 or 3 years.
Obviously, Nick Nurse will love to have this team versus last year's team, but there are challenges that come with this. Who's going to get the ball at the end of the game is one of the challenges. Another challenge is going to be, what do you do with Joel Embiid? Is Joel Embiid going to be able to become the player that they need him to be, which is a guy who is low in the block and does the dirty work, as opposed to a guy who stops at the top of the key and wants to shoot?
Yeah, I mean, those are some of the big questions, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Nick sort of navigates all of the different options that he has over the course of the season, because there are so many different styles of lineups. There's so many different, even within those lineups, styles of play that the Sixers can embrace on both ends of the floor. And to me, if I were Nick Nurse, my goal would just be that in mid-April, when the playoffs start, I have the best possible sense of what my best lineups are, what my best looks are. He's going to stagger his stars for sure. Which of, are they better off playing LeBron and Tyrese together? Or are they better off splitting those guys up and playing Tyrese with VJ? In that case, do you play LeBron more with Jalen or Joel? The best the Sixers can set themselves up to have confident answers to all of those questions by the time the playoffs roll around, I think that is going to be the best case scenario for them, because ultimately they don't have a lot of bad options as far as lineups and rotations and styles of play are concerned, because they have 5 really, really, really good players. And as we talked about, some pretty good depth now too. So, that of course also involves player buy-in, like you said, Jeff. What is Joel going to be willing to do offensively? If Nick Nurse says, hey, we want to use you as sort of a hub of offense where you're more focused on passing and creating for others than scoring yourself, how does Joel respond to that? If Jalen Brown, who's coming off taking 16 2-point attempts per game last year in Boston, which is an absurd number, if the Sixers say, hey, we want you to be in the starting lineup, primarily a spot up 3-point shooter and a cutter and a defender, how does he respond to that? I think everybody involved is going to have to sacrifice. I think you're going to hear the Sixers using that word a lot as the season gets going and as training camp starts in early October. And it's true that is what they're going to need in order to make this thing work, because none of these guys are going to be able to exactly handle the sort of workload that they probably could in a quote unquote best case scenario. But I think everybody involved, the hope would be is that they're going to be more focused on winning than anything else.
Well, and I'm curious with Embiid. This is the first offseason in a while that he's coming in, healthy for Joel Embiid standards. He's not coming off of a surgery. He's not coming off of playing.
That we know about.
Jeff knows I hate this time of year because you see pictures of people in shorts. Ben Simmons out there dunking like he's going to come back again. We should all watch those videos. But Joel Embiid, the picture of him looked like his body looked much trimmer and in much better shape. I don't know what you've seen so far, but what's the talk of the shape that he's coming in, and what would be a realistic workload for him this season?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have not seen Joel in person, other than I have seen the pictures that we've all seen, and he does look noticeably trim. I will add 2 years ago in training camp, we all thought, I remember being in the Bahamas and all of us on the Sixers beat thought that he looked like he was in great shape, but his knee was in horrible shape. And you can't exactly tell that from the outside all the time, though his knee does have a bit of a gnarly look to it at this point with all the surgeries that he's gone under in the past. So it doesn't mean everything, but it certainly is a good sign that he seems to be in great condition. The Sixers have been talking a lot about the importance of him having a healthy offseason, like you said. Instead of having to do a bunch of rehab work, he can actually do basketball work and skill work in the summer and try to improve. It's not that Joel is lacking for skill, but that is something that can really make a difference. And I think the Sixers hope that it'll pay dividends. And as far as the exact role he plays, I think that will help determine, what his workload is like. Because if you just said he plays 32 minutes per game, a 32-minute outing on this team is a lot lighter than a 32-minute outing on a previous Sixers team, where every minute of those 32, the offense revolves around Joel and they're running everything through him. It's sometimes hard not to do that because he can be such a uniquely dominant force when he's going right. But even when that is true, the Sixers are going to have other, all-star, superstar level players that they can lean on. And I think that's sort of what the Sixers are baking into all of this, specifically with Embiid and with LeBron, who he's going to have to pace himself too as a soon-to-be 42-year-old. Can we not just enable these guys to play fewer minutes than they have in the past, but can those minutes be lighter on them than in the past? And so I think if Joel can lean more into being a passer, can focus more on protecting the rim than getting a bucket on every single offensive possession, I think that will help for his body. Of course, I'm not a doctor, and I think it's pretty clear at this point that nobody knows anything with Joel. Like he gets an appendectomy and you think he's done, and then 2.5 weeks later he's playing somehow pretty well in a playoff game, and then there's a game he's listed as probable for, and then he doesn't end up playing. Nobody knows anything. I've almost given up on trying to guess, but the best thing the Sixers can do to put themselves in a position to pace him well throughout the season is to reduce his in-game workload, whether that's minutes or just in terms of responsibility when he's on the court.
Does it become a danger, though, to rely on Joel Embiid being on the team and then potentially not having him when it comes playoff time? Or are they better off having whoever the backup center is going to be the primary and learning to play together in an offense without him?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges that the Sixers have always sort of encountered. And I remember asking Tyrese basically that question in the middle of last season when Joel, if you remember, Joel in January last year averaged almost 30 points a game, only sat on back-to-backs. It was exactly what the Sixers could have hoped for. And then he went out for a little while in early February, and the Sixers, who early in the season, if you remember, looked great without Joel, actually better than when they had him, suddenly looked like completely confused. And I basically asked Tyrese, is this about you guys finally getting used to playing with Joel again, and now it's hard for you to get back to, your key principles and points of emphasis without him? And he basically said, yeah, that's what it is. And so that's always going to be something that the Sixers are encountering and trying to face. My opinion is, even if it's easier to say, this team would be better off just not relying on Joel in any capacity because they can't rely on him to be available in the biggest games. As much talent exists on this roster, I don't necessarily view this as a championship team if they don't have Joel Embiid playing at a very high level. I still think after all of the offseason fireworks, he is the player who, he's the straw that stirs the drink to some degree here. He's not the person that the Sixers are relying on to be competent anymore. They can clearly be good without him, but I don't know if they can be a special team without him. So I think you do need to bake some of that into your season, knowing that this is a guy who probably has to be the one that leads you to the promised land. Of course, it's easier said than done, and it may never happen. But I don't think the Sixers have much of a choice other than for a player who's making this much money, who when he's at his best, like we saw in those 3 games against Boston, can just flip an entire series on its head by himself. I think you have to bake some of that into your sort of planning as far as how often you're going to lean on somebody versus how often you're going to try to install, a lack of dependence on that player.
I'm curious about the younger guys. I mean, Tyrese isn't young anymore, but Tyrese, VJ, and, we've seen in the past when you have all the stars on the court, there were times that Tyrese deferred. How does Nick Nurse make it and the Sixers make it that Tyrese and VJ do not defer to the other names on the court, and there is the balance of these stars rather than a reliance on a dominant performance from one or another each game?
I think the first thing that you can do as Nick Nurse, and I think he certainly will, and this is something I really follow closely and always have, is when it comes to his substitution patterns, I think you're going to see him do a lot of staggering of those 5 starters. And that basically means always have 2 or 3 of those guys on the court at once, even if it means you might only see that starting lineup at the start of a game and at the end of a game. And I think that's for the best in a lot of ways, including that I do think it'll take some time to figure out the fit of that starting lineup, just with how many guys within that 5-man unit are used to having the ball in their hands on a possession by possession basis. So I think what you'll see a lot of is, whether we're going to play Tyrese and LeBron together, and we're going to play VJ, Jalen, and Joel together, whatever the combinations are. And again, I would say I think Nick Nurse should try all of these different combinations as much as he can before the season. Even when things are going well, I would switch things up just for the sake of getting different looks out there and sort of collecting information of what it all looks like. But I think the biggest thing is finding pockets of games for guys like Tyrese, even VJ, who's now a 5th option, to be able to play on the ball consistently and run offense through him. I think it's going to help VJ that just by default, other teams' weak links defensively are going to guard him. I think back to a couple games the Sixers played at Madison Square Garden in the regular season last year, where the Knicks tried to hide Jalen Brunson on him. In both games, VJ just ran through his chest over and over and got easy buckets at the basket. swung both of those games into Sixers wins. And I think he'll have a lot of opportunities to just physically and athletically overwhelm smaller guards like that. I think that's going to be to his benefit. But ultimately, I think Nick Nurse has to create a sort of merit-based system where, like, this is something he's talked about a lot, especially with role players. If they're the guy who doesn't necessarily play tons of minutes every night, but they give us a real spark early in a game, like, Nick Nurse is willing to ride it. That's what he always says. Like, I'm willing to let it go and play that guy for 15 minutes straight if they're playing well. And I think establishing a dynamic where, like, everybody on the team knows, hey, if I'm playing really well or the matchup dictates it, the Sixers are going to make sure that I get a lot of shots and we can run stuff through me. I think you're going to have a better sort of collective buy-in from the group, because I think everybody will feel like, again, it's merit-based at that point. And if you prove that that's a game that, like if Jalen Brown proves that it's a game where Jalen Brown should get 25 shots, then Jalen Brown's going to get 25 shots. If it's Tyrese, then it's Tyrese. I think all of that will be a work in progress, and it takes time to establish that sort of environment. But if I were Nick Nurse, that would sort of be what I was hoping to instill within the team.
Who do you anticipate is going to be the primary ball handler?
I think it'll be LeBron. I think you'll see LeBron as sort of the quote-unquote point guard. I think you'll see a lot of different people initiating offense. I really think you'll see all five of those guys bring the ball up and start possessions at some points, including Joel when he gets a defensive rebound. He likes to do that a lot of times. But I think on the whole, LeBron is going to take on the role as sort of the table setter within that lineup. And I think that's great news for Tyrese, who has made pretty significant playmaking leaps in his career to the point that he can be a starting point guard in the NBA. But I think even the biggest proponents of Maxey's game would tell you that he's not exactly like Chris Paul. He's not a pure point guard. He is one of the best off-ball players in the NBA, and the Sixers have not really gotten to actually show that off in recent years because they've had to have him on the ball so often. I think it's going to do wonders for Tyrese, especially to play with LeBron. And I think LeBron, look, he knew what the roster was when he decided to come here. I don't think he has illusions of grandeur as far as how many shots per game he's going to take. I don't think LeBron is coming into this anticipating he's going to score 25 points a game. But, he played point guard for the Lakers a handful of years ago and led the league in assists. Like, he's always the point guard to some degree because he's LeBron and he has the ball that much. But I think you might see him in something more resembling a traditional point guard role than what he has often done over the last several years.
All right, then who's the guy who gets the ball at the end of the game?
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that the Sixers should be scripting that in August. I think that should be dependent on the flow of a game, and it should be dependent on matchups, and it should be dependent on, situation and all of those things. I think what the Sixers should be telling themselves, and if anything, they should be telling their players, is we don't need to tap any one of you guys as like, hey, you are going to handle the pressure of every last shot. We know it's going to you. And I think they'd be better off with other teams not knowing who their late game guy is if they decide they even have one. Because in the past, let's say Joel Embiid is out for this game, it's pretty clear that the Sixers are giving the ball to Tyrese on the last possession. As soon as he gets the ball, he's getting doubled. They're putting two on him and trying to force him to get rid of the ball. Now you can't do that, because now coming out of a timeout, the Sixers have really five guys that have experience being the player that gets the game-winning play called for them. Like VJ Edgecombe had 2 game winners last year for them. One of them on a play that was designed specifically for him to take a catch-and-shoot 3 that he buried in Memphis. So that to me is like a strategic advantage that they have, that they don't have to show their hand in the way that, if they play, the Knicks, Jalen Brunson is getting the ball. If they play Orlando, Paolo Banchero is getting the ball. If they play Atlanta, it's CJ McCollum or Jalen Johnson. They have so many options that it gives them an ability to sort of mask what they're trying to do, and it just makes it all the harder to guard.
Well, no matter who's on the court, a lot of national people are going to see them. Schedule came out, I would say late last week, but it kind of is like the NFL. It drips and drabs all week long so they can try and maximize the headlines. The Sixers have 34 national games. You wrote last year they had 14. The year before they had 21. Talk to us about some of the highlights of the schedule, including if you want to see the opener at MSG, you better shell out some bucks.
Yeah, that one has to be where you start, not just because it's the first game, but, ring night at MSG for the first time in 53 years, LeBron Sixers debut, Jalen Brown Sixers debut. I think it's like $2,000 to get in. I'm lucky that I'm going to have a press credential to get into that one.
Don't worry, I'm taking Jeff's credit card, so we'll join you there on
perfect.
Jeff. There we go.
Perfect. That sounds like a good plan. But I think even if you just look generally at the schedule, like 5 of their first 6 games are the Knicks, Cavs, Pistons, Pacers, Knicks. So they're going to get tested early. That to me is the most interesting thing. Like they're sort of getting thrown into the fire here. They've got a 3-game homestand right after that opener in New York, which helps. And they're pretty local to the Northeast for a lot of their first opening chunk of the schedule. But that to me is really interesting because, again, I mentioned earlier, like this is going to take time to have all the pieces fit together. They're going to have to figure it out against some really good teams early on. And I think the Sixers' hope is that getting, the best shots of a bunch of really good teams early on will be sort of an iron sharpens iron situation, and they are better because of it. But it also puts some pressure on them early to play really well and to, make serious inroads on figuring out the fit, because they're not going to have a lot of easy games on their schedule early on.
Yeah, their NBA group play, and Jeff is a huge NBA Cup fan. He follows it really. I'm totally joking. He can't stand it. But they play the Knicks, Cavs, Heat and Pacers in that. The thing that interests me is the back-to-backs. 13 back-to-backs this season. Last year they had 16, which was the highest in the league, 15 the year before. That to me is what matters a lot here with this team, because it's these guys that are older that can't do it back-to-back nights. Now you don't have to make that choice. There's an extra day of rest in between. So if you're resting them in between games, it's 3 or 4 days of rest rather than 1 or 2.
Yeah, absolutely. That is always when the Sixers schedule comes out, for as long as the Sixers have Joel Embiid. That will be the most important part of the schedule, beyond the most interesting games, beyond the little variance in Eastern Conference schedules that happens of your, in-conference out-of-division opponents, which is a thing that I'm not sure anyone other than me even knows exists and knows how that works, but I sort of obsess over it. To me, what's interesting with the back-to-backs, because I think we all would assume that Joel is not going to play both halves of any of them, and I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption that you won't see LeBron play 2 nights in a row all that often, even if it's occasionally. Are the Sixers going to prioritize playing those guys together to build continuity, or are they going to prioritize having one available for each so that they still have 4 really high-level players? I would actually lean towards keeping them together for the sake of continuity, just because you still have Tyrese Maxey and Jalen Brown and VJ Edgecombe on the nights where you sit both of those guys. They could depend on opponent a little bit. If you're playing 2 really good teams, maybe that's a spot where you split them up. Whereas if you have a back-to-back that's, the Knicks and the Wizards or something, I don't have the list of specific back-to-backs in front of me as we record this, then maybe you want to play both of those guys against the best team and sit them out against a lower level opponent. So the strategy behind all the back-to-backs should be very interesting to monitor, specifically with Embiid and LeBron. But I think you're right. Only having 13 is a win for them, especially after last year. They had 16 back-to-backs. They actually played really well. I forget the exact record. They had a great record on the second legs of back-to-backs. It was something that Nick Nurse was actually pretty proud of when the year came to an end. But I think even with that being said, Nick Nurse and everybody else would, both for Embiid-related reasons and just because nobody likes back-to-backs, even reporters don't like back-to-backs, I think everybody will be happy to have 3 fewer back-to-backs on the slate this year.
So with that in mind, who's the most important non-starter on the team?
I would say Dean Wade. I think Dean Wade... First of all, I would say this. When you have so many, ball-dominant players on a team, it is so important to find players that can be additive on both ends of the floor without using up possessions. Dean Wade is, to me, the perfect example of that. This is someone, a lot of people say, this guy can defend 1 through 5. Almost nobody in the NBA can. Dean Wade might be able to. It might really be more like 1 through 4.5 because he's not a true rim protector. But he is 6'8" or 6'9", and he can, step in and block a shot from the weak side and whatnot. To me, what sort of stands out about Dean Wade is you take the Sixers' current starting lineup and you remove any one player from it and you replace them with Dean Wade. The lineup almost makes more sense just because you've added someone who doesn't need to take possessions away from the other ball-dominant players. You have someone that's going to take on probably the most challenging defensive assignment, regardless of position, whether it's a guard or a wing. Like Dean Wade in the first round of the playoffs guarded Scottie Barnes and Brandon Ingram, and in the conference finals guarded Jalen Brunson. That's the kind of versatility he offers. You can plug him into any lineup and the lineup makes complete sense. There are certainly other guys. Like I think if Dominic Barlow continues to grow and his 3-point shot comes together, he could be in a similar sort of boat to Dean Wade as he fits into every iteration of the starting lineup as well. Anthony Simons' shooting is going to be much needed for a team that was bottom third in the league last year in volume and efficiency from beyond the arc. But Dean Wade, to me, is sort of if there's a chess piece on this bench, if there's someone that can sort of slide into any situation and be helpful, it's Dean Wade. And I think he was probably going to be a little bit overtasked as a starter on this team, just in that he's never played more than 22 minutes a game. And I don't believe I think he's only played more than 60 games once. Now the Sixers don't necessarily need him to do either of those things. They can rely on him as sort of a super sub and someone who, again, just sort of fits like a glove into whatever look they're going for.
Last one for me, and then we'll wrap up and let you get back to all your hard work. What does Jalen Brown give this team that Paul George couldn't anymore? And how important is Brown's durability and championship experience he's bringing?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that's the right way to frame the question, because I think now that LeBron is here, like it's really a red herring, because LeBron wouldn't have come here without the Jalen Brown trade, and that's been reported and acknowledged publicly by everybody involved. But on a team with LeBron, you could argue that Paul George makes a lot more sense than Jalen Brown, just because of how much scoring this team has. And, Paul George is a much better shooter, much better defender. But I think what the Sixers were going for when they traded for Jalen Brown, beyond just the fact that they got, 6.5 years younger, you mentioned durability. The word that I've been using is stability. It's not just that Jalen Brown is going to, play 70-ish games, whereas, Paul George missed more than half of his regular season games in 2 years with the Sixers. It's not just the durability, it's also when they're on the court, that Jalen Brown can handle a very high workload as a scorer. Now, you weren't, even before the LeBron thing, you were not always going to ask Jalen Brown to be as high volume of a scorer as he was in Boston, even with Jason Tatum, not even getting into last year when he had a huge workload and usage rate and finished 6th in MVP. But he can do that. And Paul George, for as good as he was after his suspension last year, and the Sixers wouldn't have beaten the Celtics in the first round had Paul George not outplayed both Jalen Brown and Jason Tatum for 7 games. He just did not have the same on-ball scoring juice anymore. He could not get by people as much. He could not get to the rim as much. Jalen Brown, for better or worse, is one of the highest volume, most consistent self-created scorers in the NBA. It certainly helps to have good spacing around him to limit his turnovers and make it easier for him to get clean looks off, but he does not need someone to set him up. He does not need to have a high percentage of assisted baskets the way that Paul George does at this point in his career. And I think the Sixers, before they knew they even had a chance at LeBron, were looking at Jalen Brown as someone who can give them some more independence from Embiid. And I think he would have done that. And I think he still does, even though LeBron does that maybe to an even higher degree for as long as he's here. So I think if you're looking at just the quote unquote fit within this roster, it's probably easier to imagine what Paul George's role looks like in this starting lineup than what Jalen Brown's role will look like. To me, Jalen Brown's role is the most interesting basketball question of this whole team, is what is he doing offensively when they have those 5 guys out there on the floor. But I think beyond that, the Sixers saw an opportunity to get considerably younger, which I think everybody agrees they're better off doing, to have far fewer injury risks up and down the roster on a night-to-night basis, and to have someone whose skill set is more independent of their surrounding context than Paul George, who I think at this point, particularly when it comes to scoring, just needs to be sort of serviced in a way that Jalen Brown does not.
Adam Aronson, there will be a lot for you to cover. Our listeners can read it at Philly Voice, and we hope to get to talk to you through the season as it all goes on, man.
Awesome. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.